Look, until Toto Wolff signs on the dotted line, anything is possible, okay? And yes, I may be slightly medicated, so, buckle up! Because Lance Stroll is still the talk of the town, as is Max Verstappen, and is George Russell, so, I'm mix them together. Besides, I'm kind of bored of the Red Bull ecosphere of news stories at the moment. Supposing George Russell shacks up with Papa Stroll's team. Could that work? I mean, come on, from a PR angle, abso-freaking-lutely. It's like the modern-day equivalent of Jensen Button. He is always game for a sponsorship opportunity. James Bond, 007, George Russell in a tuxedo. He would put the Williams-Kingsman collaboration a few years ago to shame. But then, of course, that's not what you're here for. You want to know whether or not Aston would actually take George, or whether George would actually take Aston. And yes, regularly Toto and the Mercedes comms chief Bradley Lord have said many times that George isn't going anywhere, that Toto is more than ready to put George in the car for the next couple of years. They just need to sit down for about a few hours or so. Well, okay, if it's simple, then why haven't you done it already? Don't you think George has done enough already to convince the higher-up bods at Mercedes that he's worthy of keeping around for a little bit longer? Look where George is in the championship. He's fourth in the standings, catching up to Verstappen, by the way. He's spearheading the W16 development, which actually turns out to be a fair decent better than the W15, and yet there's still no deal. Even as the engine's coughing up some surprising failures that Mercedes still cannot explain. They've got no understanding as to why the engines are conking out, and that poor Antonelli is the main person who gets these DNFs, and this could be a cause for concern for some of the other Mercedes customers. It's afflicted Alonso already, and the McLarens, I'm pretty sure that Red Bull and Verstappen will be more than happy to see a mechanical retirement for either Norris or Piastri. It would easily put him back in the game. Even more so if Max goes on to win that particular race. Sure, I've seen numerous rumblings going up and down the internet that both George and Kimi are set to be getting big contract extensions. I think the latest one for Kimi was like a 4-year deal or something like that, which is understandable given his age. And then with the case of George, it's like a 2+1 deal, which seems relatively bog standard, but yet we've not seen it go down. Because yes, I hear you, Toto, that it's quite easy to finalize the thing, but it just seems like the paddock is simply not buying your explanation. I even heard Toto in various interviews, I think right at the beginning of the season, saying, oh, the Verstappen thing is completely done and dusted. Don't worry about that. We're all about George and Kimi. People can talk to George. George has been talking to other people, as he has been with Zach and Andrea. Not that I would expect that to go anywhere, but he has been talking to them. And the confusion just gets even weirder, because then I got a snifter of a Mercedes Instagram account, a fan one. It's got really big followers. It doesn't help they use the same logo as the F1 team, and they're blue check marked on Instagram. And then Mercedes-Benz USA goes like, yeah, shaking hands emoji to the news that both drivers are set to be getting an extension. So is there some kind of confusion here, or did Mercedes-Benz USA leak the deal already without us knowing? So props to the person on Twitter who gave me that shout out and tip off. It's just playing silly buggers with your drivers, which is exactly what Alpine did with Oscar and Fernando, and they lost them both. So if you're not careful, you might want to keep George, but then it might be too late. So until I hear from Toto himself, what I see from these things, it's all up in the air still. That lead Mercedes seat is not to be taken for granted, and refreshingly, George subscribes to that notion, as you should subscribe to this channel. Here is Russell's quote from Racing News 365 for your consideration. No, it's not safe. Nothing is certain. But if I stay with Mercedes, next year will be my 5th year with the team. Nobody knows when their time will come. You just have to make sure that you keep performing consistently, keep delivering. And what happens then, only time will tell. Ah, interesting. This isn't some kind of typical chest-thumping declaration that George is going to stick with Toto to the bitter end, come what may or what have you. No, Russell's being quite real here, and nor is he expecting the team to do the same, chest-thumping in George's favour, despite the team being a more relaxed environment in the wake of Lewis Hamilton's departure. And hey, don't take my word for it, take it from Valtteri, who said the place is more chill with a younger aura around it, and he should know. It's still a team in the rebuilding phase, and a team which is reinventing itself, trying to find a figure that it could build itself around for the long term, and for the longest time, and probably still now, you think it would be Russell. And if you said this 5 years ago, absolutely! You'd be building this team around George without a second thought. Now though, it's a little bit cloudy because, well, Verstappen's not fully committed to Red Bull, Kimi Antonelli exists, and even though Isaac Hadjar's coming in hot to become this season's most impressive rookie, but this is not the fault of George Russell though, no. This is not down to a lack of performance, no. It's down to really poor timing. He arrived at the senior team arguably 1 year too late, and he honed his craft at the wrong team. Even though arguably it did give him the hunger to try and push for points, even though it looked likely there wasn't going to be any. But as we found out in recent interviews, it could have easily been different in many different respects and points throughout Russell's career. Russell has said that he was originally meant to debut with Force India. He's even tested with them, a promising midfield outfit before it then collapsed, of course, financially. That plan evaporated, Stroll's arrival and his father purchasing the team reshuffled everything, and then George ended up with Williams. It was a real shame because the idea of George Russell going to Force India was not a bad move, and it would have been a natural fit, since considering at the end of 2018, the relationship between Checo and Ocon was pretty much at death's door. They were practically ramming each other off the track at every other race weekend. Having George Russell in there, right next to Sergio Perez, would have been an actually handy and tidy matchup, and also drama-free. Russell would have been squeaky clean until Lance Stroll stole his seat again. And if you're privy to the backstory of George Russell, you will notice many times in his formative years in junior formulae that the Stroll family often get in Russell's way. And then in turn, Force India becomes Racing Point, George has to take sanctuary at Williams, and then Claire Williams holds on to George for 1 year too long because she can't simply bear to lose George because he is the only thing that's keeping the morale at that team going. Maybe Claire should have just done something with a driver swap or something, Bottas for Russell, etc. And then it just makes you think that maybe we could have seen George and Lewis 1 year sooner in the W12 2021. That season might have played out entirely differently. Considering what we saw in the cameo that George had in Sakir, that he wasn't that far off Bottas, if not slightly quicker, this could have made a huge difference in the championship where Lewis did get its 8th world title. He then would have gone and called it quits because he'd gotten the 8th world title. He could go on to pursue his other hobbies, and then George would have been the leader from 2022. The point being is that we never got to really see George perform when Mercedes were at their peak. Perhaps then his long-term future would be more solid, and maybe the progression of Kimi Antonelli would have been less of a priority. Now, Russell views his time with the team as something that is ebbing and flowing, depending on results, both from him and the team. Because Mercedes isn't the unsinkable fortress that he joined back in 2022, before the W13 actually broke cover, and then broke many people's hearts. And he knows that his prior history is not going to be saving him if someone better comes a-knocking. That he can have all the previous in the world. It may not matter to Toto. It may matter to him, it may not. It's just that ambiguity is probably driving him up the wall. Russell is doing so well right now. We are seeing so many Herculean efforts from Russell. So until Toto actually gets the pen out, we can only guess where George is going to go, whereas Max's future is far more fluid. He's a world champion. But then, of course, today's video's main focus is not about mostly Red Bull or Mercedes. It's to do with Aston Martin and their potential future, and the potential future of one of their mainstays, which is not exactly a popular mainstay, but it is a mainstay nonetheless. One Lance Stroll, because that thing is still really, really weird. As I discussed last week and was very much a hot button topic then, Stroll's absence from the Spanish Grand Prix was surrounding a suspected incident after qualifying, be it to do with being upset or aggravating his wrist, which he injured a couple of years back. Pick whichever story you find more convincing. You know, the paddock gossip or the team's actual statement. Whatever you believe, Lance did go on to have corrective surgery, and you may be thinking that, well, okay, since this is trying to correct a complication from the first round of surgery, that they may take their time, much like Daniel Ricciardo took his time in recovering after he injured his wrist in Zandvoort 2023. Maybe we might see Lance back at the British Grand Prix or something like that, or maybe Spa, where he can properly heal. No, there are rumours that he's already going to be back in the car for the Canadian Grand Prix, his home race, and one of the biggest races for Aston Martin in terms of the sponsorship negotiations and calendars, etc. Oh boy! Okay, clearly they've not learned a thing. They're rushing Lance back in, maybe at the sake of his own health. Because surely you would require at least... And no, this isn't me going sarcastically, yay, Lance is back. No, this is like, are you sure this is safe, Aston? because I'm not sure whether this is safe. Rushing him in like this just raises questions. Is Aston Martin properly managing a driver or some kind of storyline? And much like with George and Toto, nobody's quite sure what's going on. But the acid test will come from when Stroll has to perform the infamous test in extricating himself out of the car with minimal difficulty from his cockpit on the Friday. He has to do it in a set amount of time before racing begins. If he fails the test, then it's simple. He's not going to go racing. And there's nothing that Papa Stroll can do about it because it's mandated within the regulations of the FIA. But seriously, there are many consequences to be had if Lance Stroll is rushed back in just for the sake of a potential narrative or to stop anyone else maybe stealing Lance's thunder or something like that. It could really have disastrous consequences for the well-being of Lance in his later years. Is this not a factor that his father or the team are taking into consideration here? They're just thinking of the now rather than the later? And okay, I might be able to understand at least a little bit if Lance could just show me a little bit of gusto and enthusiasm to get back in the car, like pretty much every other driver on the grid. But no, we get nothing. And do you want to know what the kicker is? It turns out that the FIA weren't properly informed that Stroll even had an injury until after the fact, because you remember that Stroll got a penalty, or the stewards gave him a slap around the wrist, careful, probably that was the wrong thing to say, about not turning up to the proper station in order to weigh after Q2. Aston then told them about his injury after the fact. The FIA accepted it, but then ultimately gave Aston Martin a warning anyway for not following due process. Not great optics, and also, if they had informed the FIA, they might have actually been able to provide Lance some sort of treatment or assistance to alleviate some of the pain, right? Which is also really interesting because, okay, I'll get the foam out here, because I don't think that many people reported that Lance was in pain on the radio. No one was buying that, or at least amongst the fans, but it just seems really odd. Whatever's going on in that particular front, that's up for debate. We will know for sure what Aston Martin is up to with the FIA safety tests on Friday. If Lance fails them, do they source a substitute, or just put their hands in the air and go, oh well, guess we have to run just one car again? Then we will know for sure what Aston Martin's game is, to try and control the narrative, so that means no one gets into Lance's car and does better than him, especially at his home race. Not that, as many people in the comments have told me who hail from Canada, they don't really care. In fact, they probably would actually be happy if someone did better than Lance at the Canadian Grand Prix. And it's not like they don't have a replacement ready to go, because sure, Drugovich may be busy for Le Mans, but Valtteri Bottas is right there. He's available to all Mercedes customer teams, and okay, maybe they might have to swallow a 5-place grid penalty, which he got in Abu Dhabi 2024 with his contact with Kevin Magnussen, but it's a driver. It's a driver, okay? And if he gets into Q3, it probably might be just as good a position that Lance would have wound up in with his compromised arms. But hey, maybe this is just a case of Aston Martin just trying to weather the storm of 2025, just try and get Lance toward the end, Abu Dhabi, then get him out of the car, try and save face, don't have some sort of mid-season exit which makes it all the more dramatic and all the more attention-seeking for all the wrong reasons with all the sponsors. The team does not want any more chatter to do with who could replace Lance. They just want Lance back in the car. They can just get people to shut up about it and just accept it. Well, I mean, until the end of the season, when they can replace him, the regulations change, therefore you can't make a real apples-to-apples comparison between the two. Be that as it may, the entire situation is a very complicated state of affairs and not at all clear-cut. It doesn't read as something which is typical or something that would elicit concern, worry, or sympathy. The whole thing just feels orchestrated, as if the goal is just to get Lance out the door quietly, without embarrassment or any kerfuffle, just hand a doctor's note to the FIA in Formula 1 to say that he can't continue in Formula 1 anymore, and then that's that. The violins would play, Lance could make a hasty retreat, go play some tennis or something, go spend his daddy's fortune somewhere else, go into business or something like that. Heck, even if he takes up some sort of ambassadorial role within the F1 team, I think many people would just be happy that he's not taking up a Formula 1 seat anymore. Which, again, is a really bad shame because he started off the season so well. I thought we were onto something here. But no, we were not. It was just more of the same. But it may leave the door open for the team to investigate a pretty potent driver lineup which may get on like a house on fire. And even though there are many reports that suggest that maybe the team's not quite ready to pitch to Max Verstappen at this particular moment, there may be other drivers who'd be more willing to join the Aston Martin project, especially since it's not right at the beginning like it was back in 2023. You know, somebody to slot in next to Fernando Alonso for a year or two before he can actually make the most of his teammate killer abilities, especially with Adrian Newey designing next year's car to boot, because anyone will want that. Because let's be honest, even though Aston Martin really do appreciate Fernando's loyalty and commitment and determination, they are not building their long-term future around him. He's fit and fierce, sure, but time always wins. It always does. So who steps in when he steps out, or steps in and then puts up with him for a little bit and then he steps out? I floated many names on the channel before, most recently theorising a Tsunoda Verstappen reunion. It depends on how determined Honda are to get their way, and also dependent on how well the team gets used to their new equipment, and how it can hastily refine the simulator, the one facet of the team that Newey finds lacking somewhat. But the drivers and team principal Andy Cowell feel like they can be provoked to fix it more quickly. At least more quickly than Newey theorised. And if Fernando's only got a couple more seasons left in the tank, then surely to be able to drive and race at his best, then he could have somebody that could energise him completely. Someone he gets on with, and someone who can actually work with him if the car turns out to be a race winner and a title contender. Because, as we've seen in the past, when we do have a situation when Fernando has that kind of a car, things can go south very quickly, so you need someone who can gel well with the Spaniard. And if Newey's musings are right and that Aston Martin aren't ready to make the pitch to Max right now, then maybe they could make the pitch to somebody like George Russell, somebody who might be a little more patient, to wait a couple of seasons rather than Max Verstappen, who would want a race-winning operation right there and then, because otherwise you'd be jumping from one frying pan to an identical frying pan, or an even colder frying pan. And there are a fair few reasons to suppose as to why George would actually take up the offer. I rate George, and so do his current colleagues. Mercedes saying he brought calm and confidence as their new leader, and Toto calls him one of the absolute top 3 drivers on the grid. Off track, he's a voice in the GPDA, the biggest voice in fact. Calm in the car, vocal in the boardroom. In short, he already mixes speed with a willingness to speak up. Come off it, these are qualities that any team would want to have in their lead driver. Indeed, a report from the Times suggests that Aston is understood to be one of those who have expressed interest. What would also help is that both Fernando and George have historically been very complimentary of one another. Russell has said more than once that Alonso was one of the drivers he grew up idolising, calling the Spaniard one of the greatest racing drivers ever, after their first full year together as F1 drivers. And then, amidst all of the Qatar brouhaha with Max Verstappen, Fernando actually came to George's defence more than Max, saying that George is a great driver, a great person, believing that whatever Russell said to the stewards was absolutely true, that he would never lie. Which is actually really interesting, that in the midst of the potential Verstappen-Russell rivalry or championship bid, Fernando, since he likes both of them, would be a pretty great mediator. I mean, of course, if you did have Fernando and George at the same team with the same car, this relationship could change entirely, if it does end up being a championship bidder. But the evidence suggests, and past instances of them socialising suggest, that they might be able to at least make it work for a couple of seasons. Any longer, and then you might start to get a little bit more shaky. But they would also be part of a project which is looking for long-term success, and if they want to have any chance of staying there for the duration, especially if they're onto a winner here, they would play ball, because as Fernando has proven, he knows which side of his bread is buttered with the likes of Papa Stroll. He'd have already done his part in supporting Lance, but with Lance out of the picture, he can then be more Fernando. And George can be more George. And I'm not trying to say that George and Fernando are best buddies or anything like that. They're not joined at hip or anything. They're going to be rivals during a Grand Prix and in qualifying sessions, etc. But when they're off it, they will be absolutely chummy and amiable toward one another. Respect toward both of them. And that kind of working relationship could be perfect for Aston Martin, 2 statesmen of the sport. And if Toto is right and George is one of the top 3 drivers on the grid, then Aston Martin would have one of the top 3 drivers on the grid. If they can't have Max Verstappen, I mean, George would more than do. What also helps Aston's case in picking a potential replacement for Stroll is that, unlike Max, Russell has shown incredible patience when it comes to waiting his turn. As we discussed with Williams, racing for a Mercedes outfit which hasn't been firing on all cylinders like its glory is, without getting incredibly frustrated at the matter, is a laudable observation, because even though Aston Martin have come on leaps and bounds in the last few years, they're not quite there yet, but they're getting close. They're like what McLaren were before they got their brand new wind tunnel, around about the end of 2023 or something like that. And what makes this even more compelling is that all of this even before it was completed, was enough to entice the likes of Adrian Newey. And any driver who is available on the market right now would really more than willingly bite the hand off of any team that showed interest in them that had Adrian Newey on their books too. And Max himself recognises this. Him excited to see what Adrian and the team can do with the new regulations. Naturally, he would wish that Newey was still around Red Bull to work on the rule set together, but as Verstappen also said, there's no point anymore to think about it. He's gone. Fair enough. And besides, Papa Stroll will probably be a little bit sore if his son is indeed relegated to the benches due to safety concerns and medical grounds. So, you know, their dream of winning the F1 world title would be thwarted through circumstances beyond their control. Oh, no, wait. It was within their control. They just didn't have to rush Lance back into the car 2 years ago, and then they're about to rush him back into the car again. But yeah, if Aston Martin are looking for a brand new driver and Verstappen is not quite convinced to be able to join them just yet, maybe in a couple of years, if he does stick around Formula One, then if George Russell is technically available since he doesn't have a contract for next year, then why wouldn't they go looking for him? Especially since he is in the top 4 of the championship. But as we have discussed earlier, Mercedes do have some sort of say in the matter, that they do manage the career of George Russell. So it really depends on what their plans are. And if their plans do involve Max Verstappen, then yeah, they might want to get Verstappen in, but they'll also want to make sure that George has somewhere to go. So it's all down to what Toto's got in his head. What is he thinking? What is his game plan here? Because yes, Mercedes may have first refusal regarding any contract that George is handed, but the clock is ticking. And if Aston starts circling and they give George a contract which looks really, really, really interesting, then Mercedes might be forced to then bite the bullet and give George that 2-year contract and thusly potentially remove themselves of having Verstappen at all. There is a clear path where Russell would be the definite first driver without question. No having to share the team with a prodigy or with Max. If he could net a deal which could see him through the entire regulation cycle, like a 4-year deal, with of course some exit clauses, as you do, that would be a very good bit of long-term security. But yes, it all comes down to timing. Right now, Mercedes are being quite casual. In my opinion, a little bit too casual. Because with each passing week, there are more and more entities out there that may be interested in the likes of Russell because he is a free agent in 2026. So of course you're going to talk to him. If the team were really, truly, deadly serious, then they would just lock them in immediately, have some sort of pre-contract going, and then when the moment came that Mercedes were looking quite tight and everything was looking nice, then you just go, ah yes, George, Kimi, just sign on the dotted line once and then it's all good to go, don't worry about it. That's all they'd have to do. If Toto is true and say it's absolutely simple, easy peasy lemon squeezy, then just make it easy peasy lemon squeezy. Just take all of the chatter regarding contracts off of the table, like McLaren did with Oscar and Lando. And look what it's done them both, the world of good. They're both fighting for the championship with a clear head. George and Kimi don't have that. All they have are words, and actions speak louder than words. Because if Mercedes act now and just give George that 2+1 deal, then of course George would be more than happy to stay because he's a known quantity and the team is a known quantity. He knows where the puck's going, so he'd be more than happy to slap that puck. Wait too long and Aston Martin becomes a very, very, very attractive plan B. You know, a new car, a clear leadership path, and everything's ready to go for 2026 with Saudi backing, you've got Honda backing, you'll have the leadership role next to a 2-time world champion, which you really, really get on with. Him knowing the score of where he is right now, lucky to be in a winning car at his age. Yeah, it'd be absolutely gravy for George. Papa Stroll may not like it. Lance may not like it, he may not even care, but the investors, oh, they would love it. And speaking of 2026, Sauber just scored 10 points. But is that a fluke or something bigger? To find out why I think there might be something to this development, watch this video next, straight after this one.